Great. I'd like to welcome to the stage Mary Nichols. I am so excited to interview Mary. I think everyone in this room knows Mary. California's clean air warrior, chair of the California Air Resources Board, which everyone knows, but it's the California's Clean Air Agency, established 1967 under California Governor Ronald Reagan. You guys remember him? Mary's first stint on the board of CARB was back in 1975. Long time ago, and she was most recently appointed as chair of CARB in 2007. And she's been an environmental lawyer for 45 years now. And she's been one of the most important leaders, quietly and sometimes not so quietly, pushing on the policy and legal levers to deliver California's clean air. So I wanted to kick off the conversation talking about how far we've come. California's got 655,000 electric vehicles on its roads now, about half of the total in the United States. And last summer we saw California greenhouse gas emissions fall below 1990 levels for the first time. So what have been the most important policy and legal levers that have delivered these milestones so far?
Well, you probably don't hear too many people going out and waving the flag for regulation, but that's what I do. I'm a regulator, okay? I work for the government. I have legislation that gets passed. Sometimes I get to play a role in shaping that legislation or defending it, but most of what I get to do is to actually work with a board and a whole team of experts and scientists, lawyers, engineers to develop the tools that actually enable those laws to work. So we adopt regulations, and the main ones that we've adopted over the years that have been the most consequential have really been the tailpipe emissions standards for vehicles, the mandate for sales of zero-emission vehicles, which we piggybacked onto those standards, the fuel standards. We don't get to set fuel economy, the CAFE standards. That's done by a federal agency, NHTSA. But we get to set fuel quality standards. And so the low carbon fuel standard, which required whoever sells motor vehicle fuels in California to reduce the overall content of those fuels, these are the things that have turned out to be probably the most influential in changing behavior and in creating opportunities for people to figure out how to bring forward new technologies that have made the difference. So, I believe in technology's ability to transform us, not just because it's inherently good, although it certainly can be, but because I've seen what happens if you set a standard by regulation and then turn the ingenuity of our inventors to work. You can get technology to come forward, and it always seems to be cheaper than everybody said it was going to be.
Yeah. And on the flip side, transportation emissions are going up in California. So what do we need to do next to tackle that trend?
Well, there's two things. First of all, we really have to double down on the zero-emission vehicle world and move quickly in the direction of battery electrics, fuel cell vehicles, particularly in the heavy-duty area where we've got all the trucks that are about half of what the emissions are from our state. These are not the passenger cars. These are the things that are hauling stuff around, sometimes within the state, sometimes just passing through the state. But we have to get a handle on that. And then we need to get a handle on the amount of overall driving that we're doing, because our VMT, vehicle miles traveled, have risen at about twice the rate of our population, even with people moving into cities where, in theory at least, they shouldn't have to drive as much because they're living in a more compact area. But because of mistakes, I think, that we've made in the past in planning, in the way all of the incentives work, we've made it hard for people to get around without cars.
And you're talking about in terms of housing or public transit, or what kind of mistakes?
Well, public transit, if people are riding it. You can have buses riding around that are empty and you're not accomplishing anything. So we have to have buses that go to where people need to go, that are responsive to the changes in patterns of where people go to work. And then those buses also have to be zero emission. So, step by step, ARB is adopting the regulatory framework that says, for example, transit buses all are going to have to be zero emission, by 2030, and all new buses. But we're still going to have a lot of old vehicles out there on the road that need old-style liquid fuels, and we're going to have to figure out what to do about those. And part of it is just to hopefully use them less.
Yeah, and one of the market and policy levers, of course, is the strict auto emission standards that California uniquely has, stricter than the federal government. To set the stage about this conversation, why are these stricter standards important?
Well, they started off being necessary because California discovered bad air ahead of other people, and our bad air was mainly attributable to the fact that we had an inrush of population during World War II. We had a lot of petroleum being burned, and we had very bad smog in Southern California. Since then, of course, smog has popped up all over the world, and other people have come to recognize it. But the more we learn about air pollution as a public health issue, the more we realize that at reasonably low levels, even when you don't see the black cloud hanging over your city, you are breathing things that are harmful to your health, to the point where the World Health Organization now rates air pollution as the #1 environmental killer. It is shortening people's lives and impairing their ability to be productive. So we have to take it seriously as a matter just of our own survival.
Right, and to talk about the Trump administration, and the EPA clearly disagree with the importance of the stricter California auto emission standards. And I think a lot of people have been following this, but to just kind of put it in context, last month EPA and Transportation Secretary announced they're revoking California's authority to set stricter auto emission standards. And Governor Newsom and Mary last month helped lead a lawsuit against the Trump administration over the reversal of that waiver. So a battle is happening. What is at stake, and what are the next steps?
Well, what is at stake is California's fundamental right under the Clean Air Act to enforce stricter standards, which, as we just said, we need for health reasons. But we've also demonstrated over time that by moving faster and further than the federal government has been able to do politically, we have been able to move the whole industry, not just in California, but now increasingly around the world, in the direction of more advanced technologies and cleaner vehicles. So people are watching what's happening with this particular battle in a way that not all the Trump rollbacks and bad moves that they've been making on our water and land don't always attract as much attention. This one attracted global interest because people know that California's air standards, our vehicle emission standards, are really critical as a foundation for what's going on literally worldwide. So we believe that legally we're on solid ground. The Clean Air Act says in plain words that California will get the waiver when we show that there's a need, which we think is pretty obvious, but we've documented it extensively, why it's important for us to be able to set these standards, and that they're technologically feasible. And again, there's really not much of an argument about that. So the administration, the Trump administration, has been trying to make the case that somehow, even though that's what it says, really what we're doing is we're trying to set fuel economy standards. And if we're setting fuel economy standards, that's illegal. So it's a kind of a mismatch of issues and arguments. And while you can never predict completely what will happen when you get all the way to the Supreme Court, we have, as the governor said, a very good track record on this. So ultimately, we think that we'll win. But really, the most important thing, I think, to know is that while this is going on, the world is moving forward, and the industry is, in fact, moving in the direction of producing more and better models of ZEVs. They're producing cars with better fuel economy than each year than they had the year before, even in their big SUVs. So, we've got the opportunity with other tools and working with the industry to actually accelerate the pace of change.
And talking about the auto industry, California has this unusual deal with some of the automakers to agree on a stricter standard than the federal government, but not as strict as the Obama administration agreement. So why do you think some of the automakers have embraced working with California while others haven't?
Well, the 4 companies that formally signed on to the framework that you're talking about are all companies that see the future as being in the direction of zero. It's Volkswagen, which had a near-death experience when they were caught in a massive cheating scandal with their diesel vehicles and decided this was going to be their opportunity to completely remake the company. So they're on a path to 100% electric, and they're moving very quickly and very effectively in that direction. BMW is a company that has a broader view of the transportation world than many do. They do a lot of really interesting work around urban mobility, and they too want to be in a space where they're part of the future. They want to be with California. Of course, the biggest of the companies that signed on with us was Ford, and I think what happened there, honestly, was that they were among the big U.S. companies that went to the White House and told the president they didn't want the rollback. And the president essentially, I wasn't in the room, but we've heard lots of stories, told them they didn't know what they were talking about, that he knew what was best for them, and that was just not acceptable. I mean, it's one of the things about being a large, old company is that you also feel, especially if, the CEO happens to have his name on the company, you feel entitled to judge what's best for your company, and they decided that being with California was a better place to be.
And just to kind of circle back on companies who might not have embraced the agreement, why do you think they would not want to embrace that?
Well, there's a fear factor. We've talked a lot about Ford versus General Motors. My experience going back to the Clinton administration was that General Motors was always a laggard when it came to being a part of adopting newer, more progressive standards for the environment. But, they got there. They were also, as you may remember, back in 2008, 2009, they went through bankruptcy. They were in terrible shape because of mostly the falling apart of our financial institutions. And so they embraced the Obama standards. But the minute that they got back on their feet again, they sort of went back to their old ways.
You're famous for bringing together disparate groups. I mean, the auto emission agreement is a good example of that, or cap and trade last year. And an article in The Atlantic, I think it was a couple years ago, mentioned you weren't above bringing homemade cookies to contentious meetings to lighten the mood. What are some of your strategies for collaborating with groups like this and kind of getting a consensus?
Well, I actually do bake pretty good cookies, but I don't get to do that too often. I think it's always important to be looking ahead and looking towards what strategies maybe haven't been tried, as well as fishing around in your attic for things that have been done before and that have worked before but haven't been done for a while. So this framework agreement that we were just talking about with the 4 companies is essentially a voluntary standard. We are not, assuming that we are still in limbo and we don't have the ability to force anybody to comply with our standards, we're basically saying, come enter into an agreement with us. Sign a memorandum, and we'll have a voluntary agreement, but it'll have the effect of being a binding contract, and we'll get the same results as if we had a regulation. This is an idea that actually I helped to bring forward back in the Clinton years when we were working on trying to meet ozone standards in the Northeast, and the states were struggling because they were having to deal with the effects of smog that was blowing in from the Midwest, literally. You know, they're at the receiving end of a lot of the pollution that's generated in the Midwest, and they were having a hard time figuring out how they were going to be able to meet the basic health standards. And so we went to the industry and asked them to agree to some standards, which they would have fought to the death if we had tried to impose them by regulation. But we came out with a proposal that said, we have these standards, we won't put them into effect unless and until everybody agrees to them, every company signs on, and then we'll have a national low-emission vehicle program where instead of just having to meet the standards in California and the states that sign on to California, there'll be one standard for the whole country. And we won. I mean, they agreed to it, they liked it, they thought it was a good deal. We moved on from there. So this was not a new invention of just this past year. We've been here before. And in that sense, I think it is helpful to have had the experience going back to the early days of the Clean Air program to see some of the things that we've been through and how we've overcome some of those difficulties.
And I would just like to note, Mary filed her first lawsuit against the EPA in 1975.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And now we're going to go.
I've been suing them for a long time.
Now we're going to go to sidebar to ask an audience question.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being here, Mary. I want your recipe. Thank you. I love cooking myself, baking. What advice? Not everyone here is from California. So what advice would you give to business leaders about how to work with their state and local governments to build effective, inclusive policies like the ones here in California to support decarbonation? How can they work with their own states and local governments?
Well, you know, I've had the opportunity in the last couple of years to do some traveling, meeting in other states with groups of activists and also with some local elected leaders and state elected officials as well. And I've seen, as again, Governor Newsom pointed out, we've got 24 states that joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, which was a group of states that began as a reaction to the newly elected President Trump announcing that he was going to pull the country out of the Paris Accord. And these states, again, not all Democrats and certainly not all followers of California, because every state has its own structure, its own CEO, its own interest in what's special about them. But to a state, they felt like this was a step backwards and they didn't want to be there. States in general are looking to compete with each other as well as collaborate around how to attract the kind of businesses that everybody wants, you know, to be thought of as being a place that people want to come and live, where your citizens, when the kids grow up and go to college, they come back and have jobs, have opportunities, where you're a participant in the global economy, which, you know, whether you're in North Dakota or Florida or Idaho or California, New Mexico, wherever, you know, you are part of, you recognize as a state that you have a stake in that. And I think that these movements have to rise up, you know, organically, but also that we can be helpful in providing some of the technical information and just some of the experiences of how these programs have worked that we've been able to implement and how they can work in other states as well. And we're seeing now in the philanthropic community, the foundations that support advocacy, that they're focusing in on trying to build the base within their own states to do some of these things, because they really are the laboratories where things happen. So people don't all have to do exactly the same program that California does, although they do have to follow our car standards. They can't set up new emission standards for cars. But for pretty much everything else, these things are all adaptable, and they should be adaptable.
Do you have one more question?
I do.
Go for it.
So this is a very thorny problem, transportation in particular, and I think it can seem overwhelming. So what sectors should we prioritize first, like heavy trucks? I mean, is there anything that we really should drive forward more fast on right now?
Wow. Transportation is the big thing, but probably the first thing, and even though it's not exactly easy, it's at least relatively easy to get your arms around, is the electricity sector and decarbonizing electricity, because in many states that's an even bigger problem than it is here in California, where we never were coal dependent. There are places where coal or even fuel oil are their primary fuels, and those are the biggest emitters for sure. But even within the transportation sector, I think there are opportunities at the local level, in particular, to work around certain types of solutions, depending again on what your economy is really based on. You can see where there are cities that have opportunities to get into zero-emission transit systems that are, where they already have the base of transit there and don't have to create it the way we do in a lot of the Western states.
Good, so something at the local level. I think we're going to have to wrap up. That's all we have time for, but please give Mary Nichols some applause. Thank you so much for being here.